We're joined now by a leading conservative voice here in Washington, the former Republican senator from South Carolina, Jim DeMint. He's now the president of the Heritage Foundation here in Washington. Senator, thanks very much for joining us.
Good to be back.
So realistically, what can the Republicans do to counter what the president is about to announce?
Well, it's important to understand what the president's doing first, because this is not about deportation. Once they get past the border, there's very little risk of deportation. The president is going to issue work permits to 4 or 5 million Americans. You can balance that with 4 million waiting now to come the legal way. They've been waiting and paying their money. I don't think Americans are going to respond well because it's unfair to those who've come here the legal way, and it will cost our country a lot of money.
So what can you do about that? When I say you, I mean you and your fellow Republicans, and you're very influential up on Capitol Hill.
Well, the president's going to continue to bully Republicans until they take a stand, and that's basically what he's doing. Whether it's this or more EPA regulations, more FCC regulations on the Internet, he's going to keep pushing. So Republicans have a hard decision to make, and their only tool really is whether they fund this action that they consider illegal. So I know there'll be a lot of debate about that. They have to understand first what the president's doing, but I'm sure he's going to make us think it's about these people who live in fear of deportation. That's not it. It's actually work permits, Social Security numbers for people who came here illegally.
But you know that the Senate already passed legislation which goes even further than what the president is going to do unilaterally tonight. It's languished in the House of Representatives, but it did pass in the Senate, bipartisan.
And what the House has said is we want immigration reform, which is not what the president's doing. It does need to be step by step, Wolf. We need to secure the borders. If we can't control the borders, the rest doesn't matter. But then we need to work through a process of a workforce identification system. We need to right now just empower our border patrol, our border enforcement to do what the laws say. And I think that's what Americans want. Enforce the laws first, and then we can deal with those who came here.
Is shutting down the government an option right now? Should the Republicans go that far?
Well, if it's shut down, it'll be the president, because I know the Congress is not going to shut it down. Now, they may send the president a bill that funds all government operations except for his amnesty. And in that case, he would have to decide, does he want to shut the government down or accept the funding?
Do you recommend that they do that?
Well, I'm not making any recommendations except that I think if the Congress considers this unlawful, which I think they will, and if Democrats
unlawful is a strong word. Because it raises the specter, and some of your fellow Republicans have actually raised the specter of impeachment.
Well, I don't think that's something we should talk about at this point.
So you're ruling out that?
We should keep the focus on the fact that the president is doing something that is against his oath of office to faithfully execute the laws. He has not done that. His talk of amnesty, Wolf, has created a wave of illegal immigrants at the border. What he's doing now and what he is going to do tonight is not going to fix immigration. It's going to make it much, much worse.
But you know that he will point out tonight that every president since Eisenhower has gone ahead and signed executive orders changing the immigration rules, including Ronald Reagan, including George H.W. Bush.
And that will be very misleading. Congress passed an amnesty bill which Reagan accepted because of the promise of border security. He regretted that. We know because Ed Meese works with us, and he was his Attorney General.
But then after that became the law of the land, that amnesty bill, he then went further and he made further changes.
Well, he did, to keep families together.
And so did George H.W. Bush.
But he was executing a law passed by Congress. The president is not doing that.
He says he's got the legal opinion from the Justice Department, the Department of Homeland Security, and he will announce it tonight that what he is doing is fully legal. He has the legal authority to go ahead and implement that kind of action.
Normally, a president would share those legal documents before making a decision.
They presumably will share those legal opinions from the Department of Justice if, in fact, he does make that credible legal argument.
Well, he said 2 years ago on air that this would be illegal for him to do, that he had done as much as he could do legally. He had to wait on Congress. Now, I know his opinions evolve a lot, but this is a big evolution from something he said was illegal to something he now says.
What they're now saying, and you're right, he did say, I'm the President of the United States, I'm not the Emperor of the United States. Certain things I can do, certain things I can't do. Their explanation now is what he was suggesting, and he said it several times, it's all on videotape, you correctly point that out, was he was saying he couldn't unilaterally implement what the Senate passed. but he could implement nuances of what the Senate passed.
Right.
That's what they're saying now.
Well, when Americans figure out that in a time of really an economic downtime, that he is giving work permits to 4 million Americans, while those who came here legally, naturalized American citizens and those who have legal work permits, are going to have a harder time finding jobs. This is not fair to people who do it the legal way.
Here's the question that I've been asking all day, in fact, for several days. It passed the United States Senate, went to the House of Representatives, and you were a lawmaker for a long time. Why didn't the House come up with its own legislation, then send it to a joint House-Senate conference committee, work on it together, come up with some compromise, if you will, and then send it to the President to sign into law, or to veto it if he wanted to veto it? Why wasn't there kind of cooperation? The House Speaker didn't even let it come up for a vote.
Well, the House Speaker talked about what needed to be done, and so did a number of people in the House, that we need a step-by-step approach. We don't need an amnesty-first approach to immigration. And the Senate was not willing to consider that. The President was not willing to consider that.
But he didn't even allow it to come up and be debated, to come up with their own version, and then have a joint House-Senate conference committee to come up with a compromise.
Well, they could not trust the President to do what he said, and that's what it comes down to.
Why not challenge the President, come up with something that passes the Senate, something that passes the House, come up with a bipartisan compromise, and send it to the President, see what he does?
Well, we've got a proposal at Heritage, a 10-point plan that the President can do on his own to create just enforce our system and control our borders so that we can move towards a system that we can reform. You can't reform it if he's not willing to enforce the border right now.
Here's a question that a lot of people are asking today. Let's say the President does go ahead, as he says he will, signs this 5 million people who are here in the United States. They come out of the shadows, they register, they get some sort of legal status to work. If there's a Republican president in 2 years, would you recommend to that Republican president that on day one or day two, that president signs an executive order reversing all of this and forcing those 5 million people who are now working and paying taxes, doing what they're supposed to do, assuming they're all doing it legally, to then go back into the shadows?
Well, the people who just took the majority in the House and the Senate ran their campaigns against an executive amnesty. We need to deal with it now. Hopefully Republicans who were just elected in January and February will get a chance to deal with this. I don't think the lame duck Congress should. They certainly should not fund it before they leave town.
And what happens if that results in a government shutdown? The Republicans, as you know, will be blamed for that. They paid a price, even though it wasn't reflected necessarily in the midterm elections.
Well, it wasn't, because Americans want the Congress to stand up for what they said they would do. Now, this Congress can fund it until the new Congress comes in, and then they can handle it. But they certainly shouldn't do a funding bill that takes us through the end of the year.
Would you, as the head of the Heritage Foundation, which is a very influential think tank here in Washington, would you recommend that Republican presidential candidates campaign between now and 2016 with a pledge to repeal whatever the president's going to do tonight?
Well, if it takes hold for that long, I'm not sure what would happen. I think this Congress needs to deal with it.
Which Congress? The lame duck Congress?
No, the Congress that will be sworn in late January needs to deal with this.
Let's just explain it. How can they deal with this? If the President takes all this executive action, what can the new Congress do?
Well, they need to figure that out, because the President is going around Congress, not just on this, Wolf, on EPA regulations. They're threatening to regulate the Internet without congressional approval. They're forcing Common Core standards on the states. So it's not just immigration. The President is out of control on almost every area, and he's going to continue to do it until the Republican leadership says, no more, we're not going to provide you the funding. That is really the only tool that they have, other than stopping nominations or other things that have been talked about.
One quick final question. Are you worried that Hispanic voters will be upset at Republicans if you guys do what you're threatening to do now?
Well, I'm not going to speak for Republicans, but I know if I'm speaking for naturalized American citizens who are Hispanic or of any race, that they do not believe it's fair to allow others to circumvent the law, that they spent a long time and often paid a lot of money to come here the legal way. What we're fighting for is opportunity for every American, and it's not fair to put others in front of the line who have not followed the law.
Jim DeMint, the president of the Heritage Foundation, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you, Wolf.
Thanks, Senator.